Pastor Yo from Nelson Avenue. We are starting this podcast series, hoping that the things we talk about in this series will be helpful, not just to Christians, but also to others. We're in a very unique time in our lives and in human history with the COVID-19 pandemic happening, and we thought, let's try something that might address maybe questions people have, fears that they're dealing with. So stay tuned for this podcast, but also for upcoming podcasts as we seek to really listen to what maybe God's saying to us in this time. In this episode, I want to say a few words about the overall message of Philippians. For me, Philippians is an amazing book for our specific time, for this COVID-19 pandemic. But one of the reasons it's so amazing for us is because of the overall message of Philippians. Now, most scholars, if you ask them about Philippians, people who've read the Bible, New Testament scholars, and you mention Philippians, they'll say, oh, that's the book about joy. Because 7, 8, 10 times in the book of Philippians, we have Paul talking about joy or about rejoicing. And so Philippians is all about joy and rejoicing. And that, I don't want to say that's not the case. There's lots of joy and rejoicing in Philippians. But as I've read Philippians and I start highlighting what's talked about the most, there is joy, there is rejoicing, but if you read it carefully, you'll find many, many more occurrences and references to suffering, to trial, to something wrong in either Paul's life, Paul's circumstances. He mentions people like Timothy and another man named Epaphroditus. He talks about things going on in the Philippian church that aren't so good. Things aren't going so well for everyone in the church he's writing to. Of course, he mentions Jesus Christ, who suffered on a cross. And so as you read through Philippians, you realize there is this theme of joy, but the bigger reality is the struggle and the suffering in Paul's life, the life of his friends, and the life of this church community. And that seems so much like our lives. There is a joy that Jesus calls us into. There is a rejoicing that Jesus calls us into. It is a joy and rejoicing for many of us in lives that are mostly about trial, mostly about struggle, mostly about things not quite as they should be, or sometimes really not as they should be. And that seems to me to be the book of Philippians. That seems to me to be the Bible in general. It's very human. And if you start thinking about your life, as I think about my life, I think that makes sense. There is a joy, there is a rejoicing, but the bigger reality is oftentimes struggle, trial, and it's into all of that God brings his joy, that God calls us to rejoice. And he says in chapter 2, verse 26, for Epaphroditus longs for all of you and is distressed because you heard he was ill. Indeed, he was ill and almost died. So I'm trying to imagine this. This man is sent from this Philippian church, from the church in Philippi, to Rome to help Paul. When he gets there, something happens. He falls ill and almost dies. And I have to think about our situation today. Many people falling ill, some of them almost dying. And this is the reality that Paul is dealing with. He's dealing with his own struggles, being in jail, being in prison, not sure the future holds. And then he has people who are visiting him, like Epaphroditus, who fall sick and almost die. I mean, this is just, it's like constantly the struggle, the agony of life. And so again, in this episode, I want to commend Philippians to you, to hear it, to listen to it, and to learn from this book about joy in the midst of lots of struggle.